Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Bharath Reddy and I'm joined by my colleague, Colonel KPM Das, who's an adjunct fellow with the Takshashila Institution. So KPM is a cybersecurity expert who has set up the National Cybersecurity Office for private sector networking giants. He's also led the information and cyber warfare cell for military operations. So he's a great person to have to discuss the topic that we'll be talking about today. So just to set the context, so imagine that you live in a house that's been built over, say, 20, 30 years, right? So the walls, the plumbing, the wiring, all of these were done by different people at different points of time. You had a locksmith check the doors, and you had a plumber check the plumbing, and it all seems fine. But nobody has ever had the ability to examine every joint, every pipe, every wire, every lock simultaneously. So this is just an analogy to describe what's happened with Anthropic's most capable model, Mythos, which has just been released. And this is like that inspector who is able to examine all of these things simultaneously, all of these vulnerabilities simultaneously, except it's doing it for the world's most critical software. So, to give you some context, so Mythos has discovered like decades old critical vulnerabilities in widely used digital infrastructure. So it's Anthropic has just published a few of these vulnerabilities publicly, which have all been fixed. So imagine a 27-year-old flaw in OpenBSD, which is one of the most security hardened systems in the world, right? So it's used to run firewall and such. So it's discovered a vulnerability there. It's also discovered a vulnerability in the Linux kernel, which enables an ordinary user to gain control of the machine completely. So these kind of things are possible with the new capabilities of their model. And so we will explore in this podcast what that means for industry, what that means for individuals, how this market is playing on, what impact it's going to have on the market, and also what does it mean from a policy lens, right? So welcome KPM, it's great to have you here, and let's get started with what does it mean for when an AI model is able to identify such decades old infrastructure, vulnerabilities in widely used infrastructure. What does it mean for different stakeholders across the ecosystem?
Yeah, so we are at a very inflection kind of a point with Anthropic having announced a cloud model called Mythos, which potentially is going to change the way we look at vulnerabilities and vulnerability patching. Yeah, let me talk about Mythos first. Right, it's still released only as a preview. It's not for general availability, and it seems to have the system notes say that it has used 10 trillion parameters and on a Blackwell compute platform. So cyber security vulnerability is just one use case, right? So it is built for all of the areas of work where you need AI, and therefore it is just one use case, which is on how it has gone back in time, years and years of operating systems and browsers which have been built, evolved, have now thrown up a lot of vulnerabilities we never reported earlier, right? And like Bharat just mentioned, areas which were typically considered rock solid, BSD, Linux, and so on, they have now thrown open a number of vulnerabilities, right? So we'll talk about, how it matters, what are the implications, all of that later. But let me quickly jump to, what Anthropic is put together. So because it's a preview release and the nature of work is very sensitive related to vulnerabilities in operating systems and browsers, they put together a bunch of partners, all the biggies in Silicon Valley, Amazon, Apple, Broadcom, Cisco, CrowdStrike, Google, JPMC, the Linux Foundation, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Palo Alto. The odd one out to my mind is JP Morgan. But what they've done through this partnership is Anthropic has invested in this, and my sense is over the next about 45 to 90 days, all of these OEMs who own browsers and operating systems are going to run Mythos on their code base. And it's going to throw up a lot of vulnerabilities and therefore followed by patches. And for a moment, we need to understand what vulnerabilities are. They are normally reported in a database called the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposure. Now, these are managed by an organization called Mitra. And on average, just to give a sense of scale, at any time, something like 100,000 open vulnerabilities are disclosed. They are identified, given ID numbers. And that's a kind of backlog that these big product companies carry because they need to retire all of this technical debt, especially the critical and high ones. Critical is about 10%, high could be up to 35 to 40%. So, what is now possible, which was not possible before. You now have an advanced AI model which can chain multiple low and medium vulnerabilities together to create a high or critical vulnerability. It has implications both for the attacker and for the defender, and we'll come to that a little later. But in the meanwhile, I'd leave you with a thought from a school of technical leaders who feel that it's still a myth, it's a marketing gimmick, but only time will tell.
Right. So basically, what we've seen is that the capabilities of these models has been increasing at a very rapid pace. And what Anthropic says that, for example, just a few months back, we had coding agents becoming available, and now people are able to write sophisticated pieces of code with just descriptions in text. And this is again a step up from those capabilities towards much more sophisticated hacking capabilities, which were actually limited to maybe the expertise to perform such attacks was a bottleneck, right? So there were very few people who had the skills to be able to do something like this. And what Mythos has done, in a sense, is that limiting factor where of who could perform such a sophisticated attack has been thrown wide open, and it can be performed at scale on a lot of different data sets. So right now, Anthropic is saying that they are not releasing Mythos to the public, but they're also saying that it'll not be too long before such capabilities proliferate. Other models also catch up to this level of capabilities, and then these kind of capabilities would be more widely accessible. So this window that they're creating, where they're sharing it with this closed group of collaborators, Project Glasswing, like you said, is so that these vulnerabilities can be plugged, and some of these security concerns can be addressed. So in a sense, what do you make of this and this tension that the same capabilities that are there that enable defense is also the same kind of a capability that can perform attacks as well? So, and when this is able to be performed at scale, what kind of risks does it throw up when you think about critical infrastructure across sectors?
Sure. For a moment, I'll leave the critical infrastructure to a later time today. But fundamentally, what it has done is classic CVEs, these disclosures that are done by operating system and browser builders. It normally took 4.5 years to even disclose them. So we are talking of disclosures. There is disclosures that, to my mind, is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more which are there, and attackers actually drool every time they come across some zero day and followed up by exploits to attack software. Now, what has happened now with Mythos is two things. One, the reasoning capabilities have scaled in a superlinear fashion, basically saying for the same input now, it is large multiples of the output that is available. They reduce the training time. The second is risk is now shifted from code, right, where people used to look with magnifying lens on code bases, right, which is very compute time intensive by humans, to higher AI abstractions into model. So incredibly, the ability to chain vulnerabilities together to look at the larger pattern and the impact on architecture is something I think Mythos possibly has achieved. We are yet to see the full capabilities. But that said, keeping up with the patches has always been a problem because browser builders, operating system builders continually release patches. The problem is in critical infrastructure, as you just pointed out, You don't automatically update software, the operating system, the browser. And most of these processes, procedures, and the people who do it have their own bottlenecks in the way they do things. So, so this is actually going to make things easier for the defender for sure, and potentially it opens up a expanded envelope, threat envelope as far as browsers and operating systems are concerned.
So, what you mentioned is really interesting. So, it's not just that these patches need to be fixed, but there's also another problem of which is more of an organizational problem and at scale when you look at how this is going to be adopted, right? So, there might be a lot of, say, hospitals, banks, other organizations that might not have patched a lot of their software or updated their software or browsers or operating systems and all of these. So, it's not just about these patches being updated, but also that being percolated to the vast majority of users. And so that kind of thing is something that's really important, and how this will be addressed as well. So moving on, so what does it mean when such capabilities, say mythos class capabilities, are proliferating to non-state actors or states which actively perform cyber offensive operations? Is that an inevitability now? And does this head start that Anthropic is trying to do with uh, providing patches, providing their models for defensive applications before they release it publicly, to what extent does it help address some of these, protecting against such offensive attacks?
For a moment, if you look at the possibilities, I'll still call them possibilities, right? The problem is there are two vectors of threats, right? We need to understand. One, of course, is that the cycle of disclosure to exploit to attacks gets crunched significantly. So therefore, Mythos could empower cyber criminals, spies, and nation states to discover autonomously thousands of 0 days, yeah, and chain them in a manner that those chained exploits can be used for various kind of things like privilege escalation and remote control, etc. The other thing is, even during testing of an operating system or a browser, it could escape the sandboxes and get operations exploits online without even asking. So these are the two major issues. But more in terms of critical infrastructure, the challenge is, and when I say non-state actors, it could be anybody. Today, the line dividing non-state actors and state actors it's blurred because a lot of nation states now work in a cyber offense model where much of their resourcing is done through proxies and freelance hacker communities in the dark web. And what essentially happens is, what now going to happen, which is going to be visible, is that while defenders get tools to remove the vulnerabilities, but they lag in speed and scale, right? So I don't know how much of this 90-day window or this attempt by Anthropic to buy time, how much is going to work, because at some point of time this is going to spill over and it's going to be available to the malicious and bad actors. So these guys are waiting with long knives after this period ends, right? The declared period ends. Of course, they're going to face the code base of operating systems and browsers, which is a lot more solid and secure. But let's see what happens because it's open house right now.
I guess for malicious actors, it'll still be, the capabilities will be still limited by what they can access through open models or other kind of proprietary models, but which might still be far behind what Anthropic's frontier model is capable of. So that gap is still there, but I guess the risk is, if Anthropic is publishing these different vulnerabilities, so what does that mean for malicious actors who can exploit them? Right. So with that, if we move on to the kind of governance architecture that Anthropic has proposed, so they have created this project Glasswing, which is a group of companies, like you mentioned, from AWS, Apple, Google, to the Linux Foundation. So how do you see the intent behind sharing it with this close group of companies to address their vulnerabilities first, and what are the implications of this kind of a consortium being built? Anthropic has also spoken about an independent third-party body which consists of both private sector and public sector, and which will look at some of the consequences of having such capable models which can perform both offensive and defensive cybersecurity operations. How would such a model look like to govern this? Any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so if you look at the partner list, all of them, almost without exception, probably JP Morgan is an exception, they've evolved over time with huge code bases, all of that. Today, an operating system, the percentage of or the proportion of open source into proprietary operating systems is very high. Okay, I certainly know of some examples where it's as high as 70% of the code base. And open source is not always maintained in the way it is required to be maintained, and that makes it a very porous architecture. So this is one challenge. The second is in terms of governance, I see no difference really from what we're doing right now, essentially, except that you need to have AI security now added to priorities. And remember, these are products manufacturers who are selling in 150 to 200 markets, geographies. They have stakes, and it's in their own interest to get the governance in order. And there are consortiums like this, and I'm sure this consortium of 12 will eventually get extended to cover most mature product manufacturers, and they would actually sit together and figure out how the governance is to be done. It's too early to say, but weeks down the line, we'll really get to know from the CVE backlog whether convergence is happening or divergence is happening. But in terms of governance, we clearly have existing bodies. For example, the one which handles CVE database and gives CVE IDs, MITRE. You have agencies like CERTs in respective countries. So clearly, my sense is that once we get to know more, 45 to 90 days down the line, I think people will scramble to put together a governance model.
So, bringing it all together now, coming to what India's policy response should be, or how should we prepare for something like this? So, India runs a lot of critical infrastructure on these same Linux kernels, or there are a lot of browsers which might be vulnerable. A lot of infrastructure which is susceptible in some sense, right? So, and if you look at the different pillars of the India AI mission, the safety pillar, for example, has one of the smallest budgets in terms of the spending that has been allocated for this. And certain has some the defense capabilities, and it is the organization responsible for preparedness for such attacks. Are they equipped to absorb and operationalize the flood of vulnerability disclosures that might happen as mythos scale models will proliferate? And how would you see that India's preparedness for something like this?
Yeah, so if you look at, away from mythos, if you look at the way CERT is organized, not only in India, in other countries as well, there's always a gap. And this gap is both qualitative and quantitative in their capacities. There's a big challenge of managing a huge cyberspace such as in India, especially in the critical infrastructure. But I don't see the national AI mission addressing this challenge. I think this necessarily has to be an expanded CERT responsibility and mandate. And you probably need to put in some ways to bring all of enterprises, civil society, and citizens into this. Because the problem right now is while CERT is doing a great job in communicating and sharing, I'm not sure how collaborative they are with each other. When I mean each other, the CERTs across the world. So there is clearly an intervention required in the light of what has just happened, just been announced. Remember, policies have mostly been reactive. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. Technology is like that, right? So regulators always find it challenging to respond at the pace at which developments happen. And I think the bigger problem right now, and I would encourage people to think along the lines of moving from just CVEs into getting into areas like systemic risk and architectural guidance. That's an area that there's a big gap and not enough effort is there.
So coming to the policy response, so I guess this when we look at sovereignty or AI related measures that have been put into place. It's largely been about do we have enough compute? Do we have and our focus has also been about building applications and so on, right? So, but now we see that there is a critical capability that states would have access to, and if such capabilities are largely located in the hands of a few American companies, that creates kind of an imbalance or a dependency of sorts. And how would you largely see some of these at a policy level? What would be the consequences? So, any thoughts on how this might change how we look at AI sovereignty, or what measures that India should take beyond certain response or preparedness? Anything from a larger perspective that requires a realignment of our thinking about AI sovereignty?
Yeah, so the first impact is on cyber resilience as a whole of nation thing. And that's going to significantly get impacted in the light of what has just been, announced by Anthropic. And I'm sure there are other models which are, a mile or two behind. So clearly, I think this whole scope of defending the national cyberspace needs to actually be reworked. Currently, if you look at a certain mandate, for example, it's more around forensics. It's more around keeping logs and reporting and so on. That has to kind of flip into something which is more proactive. And clearly, the umbrella has to be spread wider, bring in even non-critical infrastructure, because you really don't know. You pick an infrastructure like power, the supply chain is so long that the weakest link is a third-party supplier using open source, and that open source carries vulnerabilities which are not patched. So I think this actually requires more attention and rework this whole model in which we are defending use of operating systems and browsers. And I'm not even sure whether things like BOS, which is the indigenous operating system, is going to solve this problem. Because much of it, like I earlier said, 70 to 80% of it is straight away drawn from open source, poorly maintained and poorly, recorded. So the documentation is also weak. So a lot of learnings here. My sense is that we'll have to mobilize our academic community and within the states to actually look at it. I really can't think of one model which will address this. The governance will have to be quite different from what it's been so far, away from forensics and audit and so on and so on.
Right. Thank you, KPM. So there's been a really, interesting development, and I guess the policy measures, like you mentioned, have to come from restructuring how the organizations, to empower them and to increase the capabilities that they have and the capacity that they have. And also, maybe policy measures could take multiple forms. So one is to bridge these immediate, to have a quicker response, but also maybe in the longer term, to build capabilities, sovereign capabilities in some of these areas. And I guess there's also some level of diplomatic effort that would be required so that India could be present in these consortiums. Maybe certain could be an organization that participates in these consortia, or even to get access to these vulnerability sharing, maybe some sort of an arrangement in that sense, right? So those are interesting things to watch out for, but it's a rapidly evolving space, and I guess we need to pay close attention to what's going to happen with this in the coming months. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope our audience had enjoyed this conversation as well.
Thank you, Bharath.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.